Hello and welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our writers, Mac Loftin, who has written a recent piece for us called Trump's Artificial Images. We are going to be talking about artificial intelligence, evil, memes, and much more. Before we dive into that, Mac, hello. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, John. Yeah. So I recently completed my PhD in theology at Harvard, where I do a little teaching. I write at the Century, and I have a book coming out in, I believe, November from Orbis Press called In the Twilight of the Christian West, which is my theological critique of the new global Christian right.
Awesome. Sounds like an exciting book. We will cover that book here on the channel, so anyone out there who's interested, stay tuned. Um, but this article about AI, you start off the essay talking about the way that the current presidential administration is using AI generated memes that are cruel and mean and nasty, posting them often on Truth Social. For anyone out there who isn't following Truth Social or this trend from the White House, can you tell us a little bit about these memes and what role AI plays in that process?
Yeah. So if you have better self-control than it sounds like John and I do, and are staying away from the social media sites, you maybe haven't seen these. But Trump on his personal Truth Social, but also more and more official government accounts, like the White House official account, different departments like Border Patrol, Homeland Security, have in the last couple of months really been posting a lot of memes, which is strange on its own for official government accounts to be posting memes, but especially memes using AI generated art. And so I mentioned kind of the most absurd or egregious ones at the start of the article. There was one where it looks like the 2008 Obama Hope poster, but it's just a picture of a guy's face, and instead of hope, it has some lurid caption about like sex offender arrested at daycare who was an illegal immigrant or something. Um, and then the one that I found the most disgusting was a the original was a photograph of an ICE agent handcuffing a black woman as she's weeping, being handcuffed by this ICE agent. And the meme took that and using this AI image filter, transformed it into the art style of the Studio Ghibli movies, these kind of beloved Japanese children's movies, animation studio, and which was a popular meme at the time to take pictures and use this AI program to make them look as if they had been animated by the studio, and doing it with this really grotesque image of this ICE agent handcuffing this woman. And so they're supposed to to the followers who enjoy this kind of content. I think they're supposed to elicit, I mean, all sorts of all the passions that Trumpism is eliciting all the time of humor and laughter, but also anger, disgust, outrage, things like that. And so, what I was trying to get at in the article is, I think that there's something particularly interesting, not just in the fact that these official government accounts are posting these really cruel and violent memes, but that the visual style of the memes is this consistent and kind of recognizable, once you see enough of it, style of the AI generated image, and trying to understand, okay, well, is there a connection between AI image and text generation itself and this kind of moral, I don't know what you want to call it, moral rot, moral degradation, moral corruption that these images are both a symptom of, but are kind of having that effect on the people looking at them. I was trying to get at, there felt like there was some sort of connection between what happens to you morally when you look at memes like this, when you give attention to these memes posted by the Trump administration. Is there a connection between that and the function of these AI algorithms themselves? Is that a pure coincidence that the Trump administration is really drawn to AI art, or is there maybe something kind of more more necessary of a connection between how AI works and the moral effects of these memes.
Yeah. And speaking of the moral component, you spend a bit of time in the essay contemplating evil, the nature of evil, and you draw from Karl Barth's thinking. And part of that, if I understood it correctly, I admit I have not read Barth on evil directly. But I think what you're saying is that he views evil as something we define negatively, like the absence of good or the negation of good, or as you point out, maybe the imitation of good. And I wondered if you could, does that sound right? And then also, could you tell us a little more about how you see connections between evil, imitation, and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, that was a pretty good summary. So the connection that I see is Bart is doing something. He's picking up an argument that goes very far back in the history of Christian theology, but he's doing something unique with it. And it's what he's doing with it that was really helpful for me in kind of clarifying those questions that I was just talking about the connection between like the moral effects of AI and maybe the function of it. And so there's a very old argument in Christian theology that kind of it runs back even earlier than Christianity in a lot of Greek philosophy. The idea that evil is nothing, that evil doesn't exist, that it's nothingness. And the idea is basically that God, in the beginning, creates the world and pronounces his creation good. And so anything that exists is necessarily good because God has created it and said that it's good. And God is good. Creation comes from God. And so the good can only produce good of itself. It wouldn't make sense for God to actively produce evil. And so that leads to this question, well, then what is evil? Does evil come from some other creator? Is evil kind of like something that exists alongside God in this kind of dualist understanding of things? And that was rejected by a lot of early Christian thinkers who then came up with this alternative argument that said, well, evil, properly speaking, doesn't exist. God creates, creation is good, and evil is the negation or the corruption or the degradation of the goodness of creation. That kind of evil is the turning away from good, not necessarily towards something that exists, but just the turning away itself, the falling away. Um, and so what Bart does that I thought was really helpful for me in clarifying these questions is he says that specifically what evil does, and the language is kind of tricky because evil doesn't exist. So to use language of what evil is or does is kind of always a rough metaphor. But he says that what evil does is imitate the goodness of God's creation, that God acts in the world in certain ways. God acts in a creative and loving and affirming way towards the world. And so evil is only the kind of negative imitation of all that. Evil is a false creativity. Um, Evil is a false love that is actually hatred. It's a false affirming that's actually denial. Um, and so it was that specific angle of the imitative element of evil in Bart that was really helpful for me. And specifically thinking about AI because so one of the I in the article I cite this tech writer who talks about how AI algorithms function. And so they kind of take everything that exists on the internet, this vast compendium that we've created of all the things that human beings have created, everything we've written, all visual art, all these things, we've produced digital copies of them, and basically all of human creation production exists in some form on the internet. And so what these AI algorithms do is they kind of trawl all of that information that is on the internet, and then they serve up an imitation of it. So if you ask AI to create a certain image, say you take a picture of yourself with your partner and you ask an AI image generator, take this picture and produce it in the style of a Studio Ghibli image. The algorithm isn't actually creating it. It's not like there's a robot mind that's like, I know this about Studio Ghibli and here's this picture, so let me create it. There's no thing there doing any creating. What the algorithm is doing is kind of trawling all of this visual art that has been created, kind of picking up uh, the production of Studio Ghibli that human beings did spend a massive amount of time and energy and love and attention creating, and then sort of spitting at you this image that looks as if it was something that somebody created. But actually, there's no somebody behind it. There's no act of creation. There's no contemplation. There's no spark of creativity. There's none of that behind that. It's this imitation of creativity. And so it was that in particular that Bart was helping me think about, which is like what happens if you ask AI to write you a poem, ask AI to produce you a work of art, to create a recipe, anything like that. What you're getting is something that looks sort of like somebody put thought and attention into creating it, but nobody did. All it is this sort of this uh, imitation of that, which there's been all these legal uh, controversies around plagiarism and AI because it's taking stuff that people put a lot of effort into and using them for its own self. But the interesting thing that this tech writer talks about is that every time these AI algorithms run, which is all the time, people are using them all the time, more and more AI generated content is kind of put back into the pool of stuff on the internet that then the AI algorithm scoops up along with everything else that was initially human created. And so this writer Ted Chiang says that if the first time anybody used an AI algorithm is sort of like a photocopy of all of the data on the internet, all of these human creative productions, then every time these algorithms run, it's like taking a photocopy of that photocopy, and then you take a photocopy of it again. You do it again and again and again. And every time a little bit of the quality leaches out. And he's talking about like informational quality leaches out a little bit. And so these kind of imitations of human creativity are also corrupting the very thing that they're imitating. And so here again, Bart is helpful for me in thinking about this, in that for him, the imitativeness of evil as nothing, this kind of this non-entity that imitates the creativity of creation, corrupts that which it imitates, which again was this, it felt like it resonated a lot with how these AI algorithms work. And so going back to my initial questions, it seemed more and more that if AI functions both through an imitation of human creativity, but also through corruption and degradation, if that's just baked into how these algorithms function, then maybe that can help explain the kind of moral degradation and corruption that I think is happening behind these Trump administration memes. Because this is one of Bart's arguments about evil, is that it is a creative imitation, but it's one that has profoundly negative moral effects on us. And so that was why I turned to him for help in understanding this.
Thank you. Yep, that makes sense. So suppose that you convince some readers or listeners and they're like, yeah, there's these negative moral effects. I wonder practically if you have any sense of how we might respond. I mean, you said something about we could view this as distasteful, but like, I'm just thinking practically. I'm like, yeah, we can choose not to cheat on an exam with AI. We can not post a cruel meme. We can not look up a recipe on ChatGPT, like whatever. But are there other steps you can think of that we could maybe consider for our daily lives in distancing ourselves from some of these types of AI uses?
Yeah, I mean, my personal thing is just don't use it. I feel like if I could come up with a prescription, it would be to just not use these things. Just I think it was this morning, I saw a study that just came out from MIT where they were looking at kind of the brains of people who use ChatGPT for a lot of their writing. And one of the things that they say that they found is that you kind of have this like cognitive atrophy, that the more that you offload your thinking to these AI algorithms, the less you need to do it. And so your brain kind of these neural connections just sort of shut down and don't get used anymore. Kind of somewhat similarly to how uh, like pre-literate cultures, oral cultures had a much stronger memory than we have in cultures that use a lot of writing. That those kind of memory functions just sort of atrophy once you don't need to use them anymore. I think the risk is that uh, if we rely on AI for writing and thinking and other forms of creativity, artistic creation, that is a similar kind of atrophy is going to happen. And so my if I were if people are looking for advice about what to do, I would say just don't use them. Just keep your distance. Um, but I think in a maybe more specific sense, um, I think that in particular, kind of being suspicious of, and I use this Barthian language of distaste around AI production, AI produced things, particularly in realms of creativity like text and art, but even more specifically in religious communities. I remember there was a news story from a while ago about someone who had created a AI video Catholic priest where you could confess to him and he would pronounce forgiveness or something like that. Like if you could cultivate a real like visceral disgust for something like that, AI generated sermons, things like that. Like I think in particular the Christian realms of preaching and sacrament, which are these kind of the real lifeblood of Christian community and practice. Like those, I think we need to have really a real kind of quarantine on those against any sort of AI generated uh, text, art, social interaction, anything like that. Because I think, and I really do stand by the Barthian evil argument that these algorithms, these programs are corrosive and degrading in a way that I don't think you can necessarily see at first, in a way that like a little bit here and a little bit there maybe feels like it's not so big a deal. But I think that this what we're seeing in the Trumpian AI memes is the kind of end point of a real moral rot that can take root when you do a little bit here, a little bit there. Oh, let me just, I want to see this work of art, and rather than spend the time to learn artistic techniques so that I can create it myself, I'm just going to go in, I'm going to type it on the algorithm, I'm going to see that. And I think that has a degrading effect on our relationship to creativity, our relationship to art, our relationship to each other, that then kind of once that degradation takes hold, it kind of builds and builds and builds. And so I think my ideal would be don't use it. My more specific advice would be don't use it for specifically creative works. And my hard line is I really do think that in the realms of religious life and preaching and sacraments, that I would love to see religious communities and religious leaders take a really firm stance and say that this is that religious life is a place in which God's creation interacts with God, and these programs have nothing to do with that. I think we see sort of hints with the new Pope. He has put out some statements that seem like he is possibly going to take a firm stance on artificial intelligence. I hope that he does, but I would love to see more religious leaders really take a firm stance against artificial intelligence in religious life.
Mm. Thank you, Mac. Final little thought I'll throw in. Just because it actually has helped me. We were just joking before we started recording. We both have a lot of background noise where we are right now, and that it's probably AI-based technology that's canceling out the background noise. So, but as much as that was a joke, it just goes to show like there might be specific applications of AI technology that don't mimic and degrade, and that might be really helpful. Maybe, maybe not. But that I really appreciate your emphasis on human art, creativity, writing, images, like, and religion, and those being a very different thing to consider when we think about AI. Um, anyway, anyone out there who missed Mac's article, you can find the link to it in the video description below, so please check that out. Mac, thank you so much for chatting today.
Yeah, thank you, John.